The scent of cedar and sawdust, once my familiar embrace, now felt like a cruel mockery. That morning, after David's dismissive call, after Sarah's hurried promises, I had sought refuge in my workshop, the only place where the world still made sense. My fingers, gnarled by age but still capable, moved over the half-finished music box for Margaret. Cannot sit around carving wood all day. David's words, light as a feather, yet heavy as lead, echoed in the quiet space, tainting the sanctity of my craft. I tried to push them away, to lose myself in the intricate inlay of mother of pearl, but the magic was gone. Each tap of the mallet, each scrape of the chisel felt like a chore, a reminder of the chasm that had opened between my children and me. I remember thinking about David's first question about wood being both strong and yielding. I wondered if he had truly forgotten that lesson, or if he had simply chosen to ignore it in his relentless pursuit of a different kind of strength, one measured in dollars and properties, not in grain or resilience. The workshop, usually my sanctuary, felt suffocating. The air, once alive with the promise of creation, was thick with unspoken resentments and the ghosts of forgotten dreams. I just needed to finish Margaret's box, I told myself, to create one last perfect piece, a testament to a love that, unlike everything else, had truly endured. Then it happened. It wasn't a sudden cataclysmic crash, but a slow, insidious unraveling. A dull ache had started behind my left eye earlier, a persistent throb I had dismissed as a migraine. As I leaned over the workbench, meticulously aligning a delicate piece of abalone shell, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world tilted, blurring at the edges. I tried to steady myself, reaching out for the familiar solidity of the workbench, but my hand missed, fumbling uselessly in the air. A peculiar warmth spread through my left arm, followed by an unsettling numbness. My vision swam colors, bleeding into an indistinct haze. I heard a sound, a garbled cry, escaping my own throat, but it sounded foreign, not like my voice at all. My legs gave way beneath me, and I felt the sickening lurch as my body crumpled to the dusty floor. The fall itself was strangely muffled, as if the workshop, in its final act of kindness, was trying to soften the blow. My head hit the concrete, not with a sharp crack, but a heavy thud, sending a jolt of pain through my skull. My vision narrowed to a pinprick of light, then to utter darkness. I was aware of my body, a leaden weight sprawled awkwardly on the floor, but I couldn't move. I tried to call out, to scream, but only a gurgling sound escaped my lips. My tongue felt thick, unwieldy, a foreign object in my mouth. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw its way up my throat. I, Arthur Vance, master craftsman, a man whose hands had shaped wood and built a life, was utterly, horribly helpless. The last thing I registered before unconsciousness claimed me was the faint, lingering scent of cedar, a cruel reminder of the work I had left unfinished, the life I had built now collapsing around me. I don't know how long I lay there. Time became a meaningless concept, a jumbled tapestry of fleeting sensations. There were flashes of pain, dull aches that throbbed through my left side. There were whispers, muffled and indistinct like voices heard underwater, and then a jarring return to consciousness, accompanied by the blinding glare of fluorescent lights and the metallic tang of antiseptic. I was in a hospital bed, my body feeling alien, heavy, and unresponsive. My head throbbed, and my left arm and leg felt like dead weights refusing to obey my commands. A woman in scrubs, her face kind but serious, leaned over me. She spoke her words, a gentle stream, but they registered only as a jumble of sounds, a meaningless cacophony. I tried to answer, to ask what had happened, but my voice refused to cooperate. All that emerged was a groan, a frustrated guttural sound that tore at my throat. Her brow furrowed with concern, and she left the room, returning moments later with a man in a white coat. He shone a light in my eyes, asked questions I couldn't comprehend, and gently probed my limbs. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was delivered to a room that was still empty of my children. Severe stroke, I heard him say to the kind nurse, his voice calm, clinical. Aphasia, partial paralysis on the left side. The words hung in the air, heavy and final, sealing my fate. It was later that day, as the afternoon sun slanted weakly through the hospital window, that David and Sarah arrived. I saw them blurred shapes at first, then their faces etched with a mixture of concern and something else, a guardedness, a weariness. My heart, despite everything, leaped at the sight of them. My children, they were here. A fragile hope sparked within me, a desperate longing for comfort, for the reassurance that despite my broken body, I was still their father. "Dad," Sarah exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion as she rushed to my bedside. She took my unresponsive right hand, her grip warm, comforting. "Oh, Dad, what happened?" Her eyes, usually so vibrant, were rimmed with red. David, ever the pragmatist, stood a little apart, his arms crossed, surveying me with an intensity that felt more like assessment than affection. "The doctors told us it was a stroke," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion Sarah displayed. "Severe. Aphasia, they said. Means he can't talk properly." He said it as if he were relaying a business report, not describing his father's catastrophic medical condition. I tried to speak to tell them I was there, that I understood, that I was terrified. But my tongue remained a heavy, useless lump. Only a choked sound escaped, a pathetic whimper that shamed me. Sarah squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes full of pity. David, however, just sighed a sound that cut deeper than any knife. "Look, Dad, we need to talk about the practicalities," he began, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "Medical bills are going to be astronomical. And your care, it's going to be full-time. We can't afford this indefinitely." Sarah looked up, her expression strained. "David, please not now. Dad just woke up." "When then, Sarah," he retorted, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think these things just take care of themselves? Someone has to be realistic. We need to make some decisions, and Dad, well, he's not exactly in a position to make them." His gaze swept over my paralyzed left side, a dismissive flick that confirmed my worst fears. I was already a burden. The fragile hope I had felt withered and died, replaced by a cold dread that spread through my chest, chilling me far more than the hospital's air conditioning. They weren't seeing their father. They were seeing a financial liability, a problem to be solved. My eyes, which still worked, darted from David to Sarah, begging them to understand, to see the man still trapped inside this broken shell. But their eyes, though momentarily meeting mine, quickly looked away, unable or unwilling to truly connect. The next few days in the hospital were a blur of discomfort, frustration, and the relentless clinical hum of machines. Doctors and therapists came and went, poking and prodding, asking questions I couldn't answer. I could understand most of what they said, but forming the words, shaping them into coherent sentences, was an impossible task. My attempts were met with patient but ultimately fruitless smiles and nods. I was a prisoner in my own mind, a silent observer of my own decline. David and Sarah visited again, but the visits grew shorter, more businesslike. David always led the conversations, his voice crisp and decisive. He spoke of optimizing assets and long-term solutions. One afternoon he sat by my bed, a stack of papers in his hand. Sarah sat beside him, looking down at her hands, her face a mask of discomfort. "Dad," David began, his voice carefully neutral, "we've been talking, and it's clear you won't be able to run the workshop anymore. The medical costs, your ongoing care, it's just not feasible. It's time to sell the workshop." My heart hammered against my ribs. The workshop, my sanctuary, my life's work, I tried to object to, scream to convey the sheer monumental wrongness of his words. "No," I stammered, a guttural sound that was barely recognizable, as a word accompanied by a desperate shaking of my head. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and stinging. David just sighed again, a sound of weary exasperation. "Dad, please, be reasonable. You can't even stand, let alone operate heavy machinery. This isn't for us. It's for your benefit, to ensure you have the best care." He pushed a document closer to me, a pen in his other hand. "It's the sale agreement. We've got a good offer. Just need your signature." I looked at the paper, then at my trembling right hand. My mind screamed in protest, a cacophony of agony and betrayal. I tried to look at Sarah, silently pleading for her intervention, but she kept her gaze fixed on the hospital blanket, her shoulders slumped. Her silence was a complicity that cut me even deeper than David's calculated words. "Come on, Dad," David urged, his voice losing its patient facade, a hint of steel entering it. He gently but firmly guided my right hand, placing the pen between my unresponsive fingers. My hand, once so skilled, so steady, now felt like a stranger's. I resisted, my muscles rigid, but he was stronger. With a firm pressure, he dragged my hand across the dotted line, forcing a scrawl that was a pathetic parody of my once elegant signature. It felt like a violation, a rape of my autonomy, my life, my legacy being signed away against my will by my own son. The pen fell from my numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. I watched it, utterly defeated, tears streaming down my face. David simply picked up the pen, tucked the signed paper into his folder, and offered me a small, tight smile. "There, all done. See, not so bad, is it?" It was bad. It was soul-crushing. It was the moment I realized I was no longer Arthur Vance, the craftsman, the father. I was a patient, a burden, a problem to be managed. The workshop, the place where I had found my truest self, was gone. And with it, a part of me died. Weeks later, I was discharged. David and Sarah brought me home, but it wasn't my home anymore. It was already a place in transition, stripped of its soul. The familiar scent of wood once so comforting was replaced by the faint clinical smell of cleaning products. Several of my smaller, less valuable wooden pieces, a carved bird, a simple wall hanging I had made years ago, were missing. I tried to point to the empty spaces to ask what had happened, but my garbled sounds were met with blank stares or impatient shrugs. David said something about decluttering and making space for your new needs. Sarah, catching my frantic gaze, whispered something about donating them, but her eyes held a flicker of guilt that told a different story. My once beloved home had become a stage for my slow erasure. My old, comfortable armchair was gone, replaced by a functional, clinical-looking recliner. The large oak dining table, a silent witness to countless family meals, now felt vast and empty. I was confined to a wheelchair, a constant, humiliating reminder of my powerlessness. A caregiver was hired, a young woman named Brenda. She was cheap, as David had proudly announced, and utterly unqualified. She spent most of her time on her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. Meals were brought to me bland and unappetizing, eaten in silence. My attempts to communicate were often met with an impatient sigh or a blank look. "What? Mr. Vance? I can't understand you." Her words, though not malicious, chipped away at my dignity day by day. I longed for my tools, for the feel of wood in my hands, for the rhythm of creation. But the workshop was empty now, a hollow shell of what it once was. David had informed me that the sale had gone through quickly, a clean transaction. He spoke with the pride of a shark, not a son. The money, he said, was in a joint account for my care, but I knew deep in my gut that it was for their control. One evening, as Brenda was engrossed in a video on her phone, I managed to wheel myself into the living room. My eyes fell upon Margaret's music box, miraculously still on the mantelpiece, untouched. It was the only piece of my life that felt truly my own, a silent sentinel guarding the memories of a love that transcended time and loss. I tried to reach for it, my good right hand stretching, straining, but it was just out of reach. The frustration was a raw, burning wound inside me. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but my body refused to obey. Tears of pure, impotent rage rolled down my cheeks. I was trapped. Trapped in this broken body, trapped in this once familiar house, and most devastatingly trapped by the very children I had poured my life into. David's dismissive words, Sarah's complicit silence, Brenda's casual neglect. They were all threads in a suffocating web that was slowly, inexorably tightening around me. I tried to piece together what was happening, to find a way out, but my thoughts were fractured, my voice silenced. The music box gleamed faintly in the dim light, a tiny beacon in my despair. It was the last thing. The very last thing that still connected me to Margaret, to the man I once was. They could take my workshop, my money, my independence, but they would not take this. I vowed it then, a silent, desperate promise to myself and to Margaret. This small wooden box, imbued with love and memory, would be my anchor, my secret keeper, my last defiant act. But I didn't yet know how. All I knew was the overwhelming sense of betrayal, the stark realization that the people I loved most had become my jailers, stripping away my life piece by agonizing piece, leaving me with nothing but the echoes of a past that was fading, fast. The silence of the house was no longer comforting. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. And I, Arthur Vance, was buried alive within its walls. The world outside my window blurred a watercolor smear of green and gray as the days bled into weeks. I was home, they said, but it felt more like a beautifully furnished cage. My wheelchair was my constant companion, a stark reminder of the body that had betrayed me and the freedom I had lost. Brenda, the caregiver David had hired, was a ghost in her own right. Her presence was infrequent, her attention fleeting. I'd often find her slumped in front of the television, her face illuminated by the flickering screen, or whispering into her phone, oblivious to my needs. She would bring my meals bland and unappetizing, placing them before me with a perfunctory air, never bothering to check if I could manage the fork with my still shaking right hand. My attempts at communication, those guttural, frustrated sounds, were met with either a blank stare or a dismissive wave of her hand. She would say something like, "What, Mr. Vance, I can't understand you," and then return to her digital world, leaving me in a deeper silence than before. My mind, though, trapped within this broken vessel, was still sharp, perhaps sharper now, with nothing else to occupy its vast, quiet expanse. I observed. I watched David and Sarah's infrequent visits, meticulously cataloging their words and actions. David would stride in his presence, filling the room with a nervous energy that was more about him than me. He would ask me how I was feeling, but his eyes would dart around the room, assessing, calculating. He often spoke of the market investment opportunities and the excellent return on the workshop sale. He never once asked if I missed my tools, if I longed for the scent of sawdust. He would tell me that the money from the sale was in a joint account for my care, a fact he seemed to repeat with an insistent, almost defensive tone. He would show me bank statements, waving them in front of my face like a magician's trick, but the numbers blurred, and my mind, though it understood the concept of money, couldn't grasp the specifics or the implications. Sarah, when she visited, was a whirlwind of guilt and hurried affection. She would hug me tightly, her voice choked with emotion, saying she was so sorry for what had happened and that she wished things were different. She would promise to bring the grandchildren next time to read to me, to spend quality time. But her promises, like wisps of smoke, would dissipate, absorbed by the demands of her own bustling life. Her phone would ring and she would excuse herself, saying it was work or the kids. She would leave with a heavy sigh and I would be left alone again, the silence of the house pressing down on me. My suspicions, initially vague and formless, began to solidify. There was the workshop sale, a decision made with such haste without my true consent. There were the missing carved pieces, the ones David had dismissed as decluttering. There was the way my bills, which I used to meticulously organize, were now handled entirely by David, my signatures often obtained on forms I couldn't fully comprehend. I remembered the power of attorney papers in the hospital, my hand forced across the line. Had I truly understood what I was signing, or had David, in his carefully controlled way, taken advantage of my vulnerable state? The thought was a bitter pill, one I found myself swallowing repeatedly in the lonely hours. It was a profound internal crisis, a chasm opening between the father I believed I was and the children I thought I had raised. How could they, my own flesh and blood, treat me with such cold detachment, such calculating disregard? Had I been so blind, so naive to their true natures? The love I still felt for them warred with a rising tide of unease, a gnawing certainty that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I was not just sick, I was being systematically dismantled, erased. Then came Martha. Her arrival was a quiet ripple in the stagnant pool of my days. Brenda predictably had left abruptly after a minor incident. I had soiled myself and her reaction had been one of disgust and exasperation. David, tired of dealing with unprofessional help, decided to hire someone through an agency, a decision he later regretted, but one that changed the course of my silent battle. Martha was a godsend, a woman in her late 50s with a kind face etched with the wisdom of experience and eyes that truly saw me. From the moment she walked into the house, there was a shift in the atmosphere. She didn't treat me like a broken object or a tiresome obligation. She treated me like a person. She would speak to me softly, clearly, even if I couldn't respond. She would describe her day, tell me about her own family, about the world outside that I felt increasingly disconnected from. She would make sure my meals were appetizing, cutting my food into small pieces, patiently waiting as I struggled to eat. She would read to me from the newspaper, from old books. I cherished her voice, a soothing balm. And most importantly, she listened. She listened to my garbled sounds. She watched my eyes. She paid attention to the gestures I struggled to make with my right hand. She seemed to understand the frustration and the unspoken words trapped within me. She would say things like, "You're trying to tell me something about the garden, aren't you, Arthur?" Or, "You miss your workshop, don't you?" And each time, a jolt of recognition, a spark of hope would ignite within me. She was the first person in months who had truly connected with me, who had made me feel less like a ghost and more like a human being. She made me feel less alone, and in that newfound connection, my resolve, though still fragile, began to harden. I knew then that Martha was the ally I needed, the one person I could trust. The incident that truly crystallized my suspicions, transforming vague unease into cold, hard certainty, happened on a Tuesday. Martha had stepped out briefly to run an errand, leaving me under Brenda's haphazard care. It was a sunny afternoon and I was in my wheelchair in the living room near the mantelpiece where Margaret's music box still sat. I found myself staring at it, longing to touch it, to feel its familiar weight, to hear its forgotten melody. Below it, on a small side table, was a framed photograph of Margaret and me from our wedding day, our faces beaming full of youthful hope. I wanted that photo, wanted to hold it, to remember the feeling of her hand in mine, to feel her spirit close. It was a simple, desperate need. Brenda, true to form, was sprawled on the sofa, engrossed in a video on her phone, her laughter occasionally puncturing the quiet. I tried to get her attention, making my usual strained sounds, pointing with my good hand towards the photo. She glanced up annoyed. "What now, Mr. Vance? I'm busy." She dismissed me with a wave. The desperation within me intensified. I pushed the wheels of my chair slowly, agonizingly trying to edge closer to the table. My left side was dead weight useless. My right hand, though functional, lacked the strength to reach the photo from my seated position. I tried again, pushing harder, grunting with effort. The wheelchair lurched forward, unstable, threatening to tip. I knew I shouldn't try to stand, but the desire for that photo, that tangible piece of my past, was overwhelming. I gripped the armrests slowly, painfully, pushing myself upwards, my legs screaming in protest. My right leg buckled slightly, my left, of course, was unresponsive. The world spun. I felt myself losing balance, gravity pulling me down with an unstoppable force. I cried out a raw, terrified sound. Brenda finally looked up, her eyes wide with alarm. She lunged forward, but it was too late. I felt my body collapsing awkwardly. My right arm, the good one, twisted beneath me, and I heard a sickening crack. A searing pain shot through my wrist, sharp and intense, quickly followed by a dull throb that made my head spin. I lay there gasping the pain, a white-hot fire consuming me. The framed photograph had clattered to the floor, the glass shattering Margaret's smiling face now fractured into jagged pieces. Brenda, panicking, rushed over. "Oh my God, Mr. Vance, what did you do?" she cried, her voice trembling. Her first reaction was not to help me, but to cover her own tracks. She quickly looked around as if searching for witnesses, then hastily picked up the broken photo, stuffing it into a nearby drawer. She then tried to hoist me up clumsily, causing me more pain. "Don't tell anyone you tried to stand, okay? Just say you leaned too far and fell." Her words, whispered urgently, were laced with fear. David arrived soon after Brenda, having called him in a frenzy, carefully omitting the details of her negligence. He found me on the floor, groaning softly, my wrist already swelling to an alarming size. His face was a thundercloud. "Dad, what happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp, with irritation, not concern. "Brenda said you tried to stand up again. I told you can't do that." He didn't ask if I was hurt, only if I had disobeyed. He called 911, not for my pain, but for the inconvenience of another medical emergency. At the hospital, the verdict was a broken wrist, a significant setback in my already agonizing recovery. David was furious, not with Brenda, but with me. "This is exactly why we need to be more careful, Dad," he told me, his voice barely controlled. "Another expense. Another complication. This kind of recklessness is exactly what Elaine and I are worried about. It's almost like you're trying to prove you can't manage yourself." His words were a cold accusation, a knife twisting in the fresh wound of my physical pain. Sarah, who arrived later, looked distressed, but she too repeated David's narrative. "Oh, Dad, you have to be so careful. You scared us, trying to stand up like that." Her concern, though genuine, was tinged with the subtle blame David had already instilled. No one asked Brenda what she had been doing. No one asked if I had been left alone. The narrative was set. It was my fault. Brenda was indeed fired after that, but not for her negligence. David said she was incompetent for allowing me to fall. He then surprisingly hired Martha. Her first days were a revelation. She listened intently as I made my garbled attempts to explain. She noticed the slight grimace of pain when I moved my wrist, the way my eyes would dart to the drawer where Brenda had hidden the broken photograph. She didn't pry, but her presence was a constant comforting question. One afternoon, Martha was helping me with my exercises, gently moving my limbs, speaking softly about my progress. My right hand, still in a cast, was useless. My left side remained numb. As she adjusted my wheelchair, a stack of mail slid from a side pocket. Among the usual junk mail, I saw it, a bank statement addressed to me. It had arrived just after my fall, and Brenda must have slipped it into the pocket, forgetting to give it to David. With my good eye, I saw the name of the bank and then a figure. A large, unsettlingly small figure in the balance column. My blood ran cold. The workshop had sold for a substantial amount. David had told me enough to cover my care for years. Yet the balance on my personal account was shockingly low. I made a frantic sound, pointing with my chin towards the statement, then to David's name, which appeared prominently on the statement as a joint account holder. And then I struggled to write the word money on a small whiteboard Martha always kept near me. My scribbles were barely legible, but Martha understood. Her eyes widened as she looked at the statement, then at me. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice filled with a new kind of concern. Is this not right?" I shook my head, my eyes pleading, willing her to understand. I then pointed to the part of the statement that showed recent large withdrawals, then made a gesture as if handing something over, then pointed to David's name. I also tried to indicate my forced signature from the hospital. "Martha, Her face now grim nodded slowly. "You mean, David is taking money from this account, and you didn't give him permission?" I shook my head again, more vehemently this time. I then struggled to recall the memory of signing those papers in the hospital, trying to convey the coercion, the feeling of being forced. I made a gesture of my hand being moved by another. Her gaze hardened. "He made you sign papers you didn't understand, didn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I could only nod, tears silently tracing paths down my wrinkled cheeks. The internal crisis was no longer about abstract doubt. It was real, palpable, and devastating. My own son, the boy I had raised, had not merely abandoned me. He had actively stolen from me, taken advantage of my weakness, not for my care but for his own gain. The broken wrist, the scattered photograph, they were not just accidents. They were consequences of my deliberate isolation, my planned vulnerability. The pain of this realization was far worse than any physical injury. It was a deep, agonizing wound that went straight to my soul. The love I had held onto for David, the lingering hope for his return to decency, shattered into 1,000 pieces just like Margaret's photo. In that moment, lying there, my body broken, my spirit crushed, I understood the full extent of their betrayal. They were not just distant, they were predators circling their prey. My home, my life savings, my dignity, they were systematically stripping it all away. But as the initial wave of despair receded, a flicker of something new, something hard and cold, began to take root in my heart. It was a determination born of deep, profound betrayal. They had taken my voice, my movement, my workshop. They had broken my body, but they had not broken my mind. And they had underestimated the quiet strength of an old man, a craftsman who knew how to find the flaws, the weak points, the hidden truths in any structure. My world had been turned upside down, but I was not defeated. Not yet. I would fight back, not with words, for I had none, but with the quiet, deliberate precision of a master craftsman, slowly, meticulously exposing the rot in the very foundation of my family. I would find a way. For Margaret, for myself, and for the dignity they had so carelessly tried to steal. My struggle would begin not with a shout, but with a silent, unwavering resolve carved from the same stubborn strength as the wood I had spent my life shaping. The broken wrist encased in its heavy cast was a constant aching monument to my helplessness. Yet it also became a perverse symbol of my newfound resolve. My body might be crippled, my voice stolen, but my mind, sharpened by the bitter tang of betrayal, was still mine. And in Martha I had found an unlikely, invaluable ally. After the horrifying revelation of the bank statement, the shockingly low balance, the clear evidence of large, undocumented withdrawals, a cold fury began to simmer beneath my despair. David hadn't just been negligent, he had been calculated. The stroke had been his opportunity, my vulnerability, his open door. The love I had tried so desperately to cling to, the hope for reconciliation, was now a shattered pane, letting in the icy winds of reality. My investigation began not with a shout or a confrontation, but with the quiet, painstaking precision of a craftsman. My tools were no longer chisels and mallets, but my eyes, my gestures, and Martha's compassionate understanding. She was initially hesitant, her kind eyes reflecting concern, even fear, when I tried to communicate my suspicions about David. I used the small whiteboard she always kept handy, struggling to scrawl simple words or draw rudimentary symbols. My right hand, still stiff and uncooperative in its cast, made every line an arduous task. Money. Gone. I would scribble, pointing frantically at the bank statement she had seen. Then I would point to David's name on the statement, then to my chest, then shake my head violently. Martha, bless her patient heart, would crouch beside me, studying my frantic gestures, her brow furrowed in concentration. She said she understood I believed David was taking my money without my full consent. She told me it was a serious accusation, one that could cause a lot of trouble, and that she was worried for me and for herself if she got involved. I could see the fear in her eyes, but also a growing sense of injustice. I tried to convey the feeling of being trapped, of being silenced, of having my life stolen. I pointed to the broken photograph of Margaret still in the drawer where Brenda had stashed it, making a broken gesture with my hands. I then pointed to David's name on the bank statement, and then to the drawer. Martha understood that I believed David had also taken away my memories, not just my money. Over the next few days, our silent conspiracy deepened. Martha, ever diligent, began her work under the guise of her normal caregiving duties. My routine became a cover for our covert operation. While David and Sarah were away, which was most of the time, Martha would help me. My first target was the house itself. I had built this house, laid every brick, chosen every beam. It was a repository of my life, and I believed it held clues if only I knew where to look. I would direct Martha with a series of taps and gestures to specific areas. I wanted to see if more of my precious hand-carved pieces were missing. I'd tap twice for left, once for right, and point with my chin. She started in the living room. I directed her to a bookshelf where I once kept a collection of miniature wooden animals I had carved for Margaret over the years. They were small, intricate pieces, each one a memory. When Martha returned, her face was pale. She said the entire shelf was empty, cleaned out. David had told me he had merely decluttered, but these were not items to be casually discarded. They were priceless to me. Martha confirmed that there was only a dusty outline where they used to be. The animals were gone. I felt a pang of despair, another piece of my soul ripped away. Next, I directed her to the attic. It was a dusty, forgotten realm, but a treasure trove of my life's artifacts. My old ledgers from the workshop, filled with meticulous records of every project, every client, every expense, were stored there in a large oak chest I had made. Martha, after some effort, managed to wheel me up the ramp I had installed years ago for easier access. The attic air was thick with the scent of aged wood and dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight from the small window. I pointed to the oak chest. Martha, with some difficulty, opened it. Inside, amidst yellowed blueprints and forgotten letters, were my ledgers. They were leather-bound, heavy with the weight of my past. I gestured for Martha to open the most recent one. My eyes, though weakened, still recognized the precise columns, the neat handwriting, the detailed entries of profits and expenditures. We spent hours there, Martha, carefully turning the pages under my watchful eye. My workshop, even in its final years, had been profitable. The numbers didn't lie. It had been a thriving business, generating a steady, comfortable income. The sale price David had mentioned, while seemingly substantial, suddenly felt suspicious when compared to the workshop's actual value and earning potential over years. David's rush to sell his dismissal of my craft now took on a sinister edge. He wasn't just selling a business, he was dismantling a legacy. The investigation into the bank statements was equally grim. With my limited mobility, I couldn't physically go to the bank. But Martha, at my desperate urging, agreed to help. I wrote on the whiteboard painfully slowly, bank. Need. Info. Martha was visibly nervous. She told me that she was not supposed to interfere in family matters, and that she could lose her job. But I could see the conflict in her eyes, the growing sense of moral outrage. I looked at her, then made a gesture as if holding a significant amount of money in my hand, then pointed to David's name, then shook my head fiercely. I made her understand that David was taking my money that was supposed to be for my care, and that I was completely helpless. I could also show her the stark contrast between the healthy figures in my old ledgers and the depleted bank account. The sheer injustice of it, the betrayal, was a powerful motivator for her. She agreed with a heavy heart to visit the bank during her lunch break. I gave her my old bank card and a note laboriously scrawled requesting a detailed transaction history for the past 6 months, hoping my signature was still recognizable. The hours she was gone were agonizing. I sat by the window, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, watching for her return. Every car that passed, every distant sound sent a jolt of anxiety through me. What if she was caught? What if David had already taken measures to prevent such inquiries? What if she just didn't come back? When Martha finally returned, her face was grim. She laid a thick stack of papers on my lap, printouts of every transaction. My good eyes scanned the pages, a cold dread seeping into my bones. There it was in black and white, numerous large withdrawals far exceeding any reasonable costs for my care. There were also several transfers clearly marked to an account under David Vance's name. These weren't just the occasional small purchases or payments for my needs. These were substantial sums systematically siphoned from my savings. My personal account, the one David had claimed was for my sole benefit, was being actively emptied by my own son. The proof was undeniable. My children weren't just neglecting me, they were actively impoverishing me. The house, the money, the legacy, it was all being systematically plundered. I felt a wave of nausea, a profound sense of violation. This wasn't merely a misunderstanding, it was theft, plain and simple, orchestrated under the guise of filial duty. The suffering, already so intense, reached a new peak. My chest felt hollow, a gaping wound where my trust and love had once resided. The realization that David, my firstborn, the son I had poured so much into, was capable of such cold, calculated cruelty was utterly devastating. The shattered photograph of Margaret still in the drawer now seemed a prophetic symbol. My life, my memories, my very identity were being broken into jagged pieces by the very hands I had once held, by the very hearts I had nurtured. The silence in the house, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a heavy shroud pressing down on me, suffocating me with the weight of their betrayal. I also remembered an old safe in my study hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Inside, I kept important documents, my original will, the deeds to the house, and other personal papers. David had never found it, and Sarah likely didn't even know it existed. With Martha's help meticulously guided by my gestures and the crude map I drew on the whiteboard, we set about accessing it. It was a slow, arduous process. My hands, still limited, made it difficult to manipulate the brick. Martha, nervous but determined, followed my instructions, her fingers fumbling until she found the hidden catch. The safe door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior. Inside, carefully preserved, were the true foundations of my life, the original deed to my house, signed by Margaret and me decades ago, a testament to our shared dream. My will, drafted years ago, clearly outlined my wishes, stipulating that the house was to remain in the family, but with specific conditions of care and residency for me as long as I lived. It named David and Sarah as beneficiaries, but crucially it was contingent on my continued well-being and a respectful relationship. And then there were old photographs, letters from Margaret, a small worn wooden token David had carved for me in elementary school. A crude, beloved piece that now felt like a painful relic from a different lifetime. As Martha laid out these documents on the table, I studied them, my eyes tracing the familiar words, the official stamps. The truth, stark and undeniable, stared back at me. David had systematically undermined every provision of my will, ignored every stipulation of my deed, and brazenly disregarded the very essence of our family's foundation. He hadn't just stolen money, he had tried to steal my future, rewrite my past, and erase my very existence from the fabric of this home. The cold fury intensified, mixing with a profound, bone-deep sorrow. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about legacy, about the fundamental truth of who I was and what I had built. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from the town, an official-looking document. Martha opened it for me. It was a notice regarding zoning adjustments and potential property reevaluation in Willow Creek, specifically mentioning my address. David had been talking about this, muttering about maximizing potential and flipping properties. He had told me it was simply a general town initiative. But now, after seeing the bank statements and the missing items, after realizing the extent of his deception, I felt a new wave of unease. This wasn't just passive neglect. This was active, aggressive asset stripping. He wasn't just waiting for me to fade. He was actively preparing to capitalize on my eventual absence, perhaps even speeding it up. The true depths of their betrayal, once a vague, unsettling feeling, now presented themselves in excruciating detail. David, with his cold ambition, and Sarah, with her guilt-ridden silence, were dismantling my life brick by painful brick. The memories I had so carefully carved into the very wood of my home, the love I had poured into raising them all, seemed to count for nothing. My heart was a bruised, battered thing, but it was still beating, fueled by a fierce, silent resolve. I was not just a victim, I was a witness, and I would ensure that my story, the true story, was heard. The music box, Margaret's music box, sat on the mantelpiece, a silent sentinel. I still couldn't reach it, my broken wrist, a constant, frustrating barrier. But in my mind, its melody, though unheard, played on a defiant counterpoint to the discordant symphony of my children's greed. This was my last remaining piece of self, a secret weapon in a war I had not sought but was now determined to win. They thought they had silenced me, crippled me, made me disappear. They were wrong. The old craftsman had one last trick up his sleeve, a final, meticulously planned act of defiance. And it would begin, as all good craftsmanship did, with the truth painstakingly uncovered detail by agonizing detail. My suffering was at its climax, but with it came a clarity, a cold, unwavering focus. I was ready to carve my own justice. My wrist, now free of its cast, was a stiff protesting thing, but with Martha's patient encouragement and the sheer force of my will, it slowly began to regain some function. Each flex, each grasp was a small victory, a defiant assertion of control over a body that had betrayed me. The physical pain was a dull ache compared to the searing wound of betrayal that festered in my heart. David's calculated theft, Sarah's complicit silence, the systematic erasure of my life. These were the real afflictions. But with the revelations of the ledgers, the bank statements, and the hidden will, my despair had transformed into a cold, unwavering resolve. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist, and my weapon, as I had once told my young David about woodworking, would be patience and understanding of the true nature of things. The first step in my silent retribution was communication. Martha, my silent partner, was crucial. I couldn't speak, but I could write slowly and painstakingly on the whiteboard. My words were simple, direct, stripped of all emotion, a stark reflection of the man I had become. I explained to Martha the full extent of David's deception, the clear outlines of my will, the true value of the workshop. I told her that David had systematically drained my accounts, used the forced power of attorney to control my assets, and was likely preparing to sell the house, my home, the last vestige of Margaret and my shared life. Martha listened, her face a canvas of shock and growing anger on my behalf. She told me it was terrible, a real shame, and that she couldn't believe a son would do such a thing to his own father. I could see the moral outrage burning in her eyes, eclipsing her initial fear. She asked me what I wanted to do, reminding me that this was a dangerous path. I simply wrote, justice. My plan began to take shape, meticulous and precise, like one of my intricate wood carvings. It wouldn't be a shouting match, for I had no voice for one. It would be a quiet, unyielding dismantling of their carefully constructed lies. I wanted them to face the truth, not in a courtroom, not in a public spectacle, but in the very heart of this house, the house they thought was theirs to take. I wanted to use their own greed, their own casual cruelty against them. The immediate goal was to provoke a confrontation, to force them to show their true colors openly. I began with small, symbolic acts of defiance, designed to chip away at their sense of control. I started leaving my old, worn workshop apron, stained with years of sawdust and memories, draped over David's sleek, modern armchair in the living room. I knew he hated anything that suggested my old-fashioned life. I would also leave my old, heavily thumbed books on woodworking, complete with my meticulous notes, in the margins scattered on the pristine, minimalist coffee table Elaine had insisted on. These were subtle incursions, but I knew they would grate on David's nerves, a constant, unspoken reminder of my lingering presence and of the man he was trying to erase. When David visited, I would observe his reactions. He would often sigh dramatically, muttering something about me needing to be tidier or keep my things in my own space. He would gather the books and apron with an air of exasperated superiority, placing them out of sight. I would meet his gaze, my eyes unwavering, a silent challenge. He always looked away first, his discomfort palpable. One afternoon, a true test arrived. A small, exquisite wooden carving of a bluebird, one of the last remaining pieces from my missing collection, had somehow resurfaced. Martha found it tucked behind a loose floorboard in my study, a place only I would know. I held it in my hand, feeling the smooth, polished surface, the intricate detail of its tiny feathers. It was a testament to my skill, a tangible piece of my soul. I decided to leave it conspicuously on the mantelpiece, right next to Margaret's music box, a defiant sentinel. When David and Sarah came for their next visit, ostensibly to discuss my future living arrangements, the bluebird was waiting. David walked in first, his usual confident stride faltering as his eyes landed on the small carving. His face tightened. He said something about wondering where that had come from, and that he thought we had cleared everything out. He cast a suspicious glance at Martha, who maintained a placid expression. Then Sarah saw it. Her eyes widened, and a wave of something akin to genuine sadness washed over her face. She picked up the bird, turning it over in her hands. She told me she remembered this one, that I had made it for her when she was a little girl, and that she had loved it. Her voice was soft, wistful, a fleeting glimpse of the daughter I once knew. I tried to communicate, to make a soft sound of acknowledgement, but my throat only produced a choked groan. David, ever the pragmatist, quickly interjected, saying that perhaps it was time for all these old things to be packed away, that I would need less clutter in my new place. The words "new place" hung in the air, cold and heavy, confirming my fears that they were indeed planning to move me to an institution away from my home, away from everything familiar. He suggested that the house was becoming too much for me, and that a care facility would be safer and more manageable. He even mentioned that Elaine had found a wonderful place several hours away, a facility with excellent amenities. He spoke of it with a salesman's practiced enthusiasm, devoid of any real empathy. This was it. The confrontation I had anticipated, the moment where I needed to push to test the strength of their deceit. I slowly, deliberately wheeled myself closer to the oak dining table where they sat. My heart was a drum in my chest, a furious rhythm of fear and righteous anger. I looked at David, then at Sarah, then back at the bluebird in Sarah's hand. I then made a sweeping gesture with my good hand, indicating the entire house. then pointed to the bird, then to my will, which I had asked Martha to retrieve and place discreetly on the table beneath a stack of magazines. I then pointed to the bank statements, the incriminating evidence of his withdrawals. I made a series of urgent, insistent grunts, trying to convey my ownership, my knowledge, my absolute defiance. David, caught off guard by my sudden intensity, stammered something about me being agitated and confused. He quickly tried to push the magazines over the will, a clumsy attempt to hide it. But Sarah had already seen it. Her eyes widened, recognizing the familiar script of my name on the cover. She said something about it being Dad's old will, and asked David if he knew it was there. David, his face paling slightly, quickly dismissed it, saying it was an old document, probably outdated, and that he had been meaning to get around to updating everything. He tried to steer the conversation back to my new living arrangements, his voice gaining an edge of impatience. He told me that it was really for the best that I needed round-the-clock care, and that the house was simply not equipped. He even mentioned that it would allow him and Sarah to move on with their lives without this constant worry. But the seeds of doubt had been sown. Sarah, though, still largely silent, kept glancing at the will, then at me, her brow furrowed. I looked at her, then pointed to the bluebird in her hand, then to my chest, and then I shook my head, conveying a profound sense of loss, a silent accusation. I tried to communicate that the bird, like my life, had been taken from me, and that this entire house, my legacy, was being stripped away. The weight of the unsaid hung heavy in the air. The silence, usually a torment, now felt like a weapon, amplifying the tension, forcing them to confront the unspoken truths. David tried to regain control, his voice becoming sharper, more insistent. He told me that I needed to understand that this was a difficult decision for them and that they were doing what they believed was right, even if I couldn't see it. He even tried to sound hurt, saying he felt I was being ungrateful that they were sacrificing so much for me. But the bank statements, now uncovered by Martha's discreet movement, lay exposed on the table, their damning figures undeniable. I pointed to the large withdrawals, then to David, then to my empty pockets, then back to the will, which clearly stated conditions for my care. I made a distressed, guttural sound, trying to express the pain of his deceit, the violation of trust. David's face turned a mottled red. He snapped at Martha, asking her why those papers were out, and if she knew she wasn't supposed to touch my personal belongings. Martha, calm and unyielding, simply said she had found them in the study and thought they might be important for the family discussion. Her quiet dignity was a sharp contrast to David's escalating anger. Sarah, witnessing this exchange, finally broke her silence. She asked David why there was so little money in Dad's account and why he was taking such large sums. Her voice was hesitant, but it carried a note of genuine confusion and concern. David cornered, stammered, saying it was all for Dad's medical expenses and home modifications. He told Sarah she didn't understand the complexities of financial management and that he was handling everything properly. He then tried to turn the tables, accusing me of being delusional and paranoid in my old age, suggesting that my stroke had affected my judgment. He even said that this was further proof that I needed full-time care away from this house. He tried to paint me as the confused, ungrateful old man and himself as the burdened, sacrificing son. His words, meant to discredit me, only fueled my silent rage. The internal struggle was immense. This was my son, the boy I had cradled in my arms, the young man I had guided. The paternal love, so deeply ingrained, still pulsed within me, a ghost limb, aching with a love that was no longer reciprocated. But beneath it, colder and harder, was the unyielding demand for justice, for truth. How could I let this stand? How could I allow him to erase me, to steal my legacy, to desecrate Margaret's memory with his greed? The emotional conflict was a tempest in my silent mind, a battle between the father who wanted to forgive and the man who demanded accountability. I looked at David, then at Sarah, who was now openly staring at the bank statements, her face etched with dawning horror. I then pointed to my will, specifically to the clause outlining conditions for my care and the retention of my home. I tried to convey with all the limited means at my disposal that he was violating the very trust I had placed in him, that he was destroying the family. I shook my head slowly, painfully, conveying a profound sense of disappointment, a sorrow so deep it felt like a physical weight in my chest. David, seeing Sarah's growing distress, finally exploded. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a loud clatter. He said I was being impossible, that I was making things difficult for everyone, and that he was simply trying to do what was best. He then said with a chilling lack of emotion that perhaps it was time for me to understand my place, and that my sentimental attachments were clouding my judgment. He then made a casual remark about selling the house soon, once I was settled in the new facility, and how the market value was through the roof after the zoning adjustments. The words hung in the air, a final brutal confirmation of his ultimate plan. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, She asked David if he was actually planning to sell Dad's house, the house Dad had built. David, realizing his slip quickly, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. The truth, ugly and undeniable, was out. The internal crisis within me reached its peak. The love for my son, the man I had raised, the hope for any semblance of a family remaining, finally died. It was replaced by a cold, unwavering certainty. There would be no reconciliation. There would be no forgiveness, not without true remorse and restitution. My duty as a father, I realized, was not to protect their image, but to expose their betrayal, to seek justice for what they had done. The line between paternal love and the demand for fairness had been crossed irrevocably. My children had made their choice. Now I would make mine. I looked at the bluebird still perched defiantly on the mantelpiece, a tiny symbol of the life they thought they could extinguish. I then looked at David, his face a mask of anger and fear, and at Sarah, her face etched with sorrow and shock. My eyes, still sharp, met theirs. I didn't need words. The message was clear. The craftsman, though broken, was still here, and he was not finished. The silence in the room was deafening, but within it a new, determined symphony of defiance was beginning to play. This was no longer just about personal loss. It was about reclaiming a life, a legacy, and the very meaning of family, and the next move I knew would be mine. The air in the room, thick with the unspoken, felt suddenly thin, suffocating. David's revelation about selling the house, blurted out in a moment of frustrated anger, hung suspended like a deadly vapor. Sarah gasped, a small, choked sound that finally broke her complicit silence. She turned to David, her eyes wide with a dawning horror that mirrored the ache in my own chest. She asked him in a voice barely above a whisper if he was truly planning to sell our home, the house I had built with my own hands, the one where they had grown up. David, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack to qualify his words, but the truth, once unleashed, could not be recaptured. It had struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow, shattering the fragile illusion she had built around her brother's actions. I watched their faces, a silent observer in my wheelchair. My heart, a complex knot of pain and grim satisfaction. This was it. The moment I had orchestrated, the moment their carefully constructed edifice of lies began to crumble. David's face, usually so composed and confident, was now a mask of fear and defensiveness. He stammered his words, disjointed, trying to explain away his comment to diminish its gravity. He spoke of hypotheticals and future planning, but his eyes, darting wildly, betrayed him. He kept glancing at me, then at the incriminating bank statements, then back at Sarah, who now looked utterly devastated. Sarah, her gaze fixed on David, shook her head slowly. She told him she couldn't believe he would do something like that it wasn't right. Her voice was trembling, filled with a raw emotional pain that resonated deeply within me. She then turned her eyes to me, her expression a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate apology. In that moment, I saw the true daughter I had known. The one whose conscience, unlike David's, was not entirely dead. I tried to offer a small, reassuring nod, a silent acknowledgement of her awakening, but my face remained impassive. The time for comfort had passed. The time for accountability had arrived. The confrontation, however, was not over. David, with his back against the wall, grew desperate. He pointed a finger at me, his voice rising in an attempt to regain control. He accused me of manipulating Sarah, of being a confused old man whose stroke had warped his perception, of fabricating stories to cause trouble. He even suggested that Martha, my quiet ally, was somehow in league with me, influencing my delusions. Martha, though visibly shaken by the direct accusation, simply met his gaze with a calm, unwavering dignity. She said quietly that she was only there to care for Mr. Vance, and that she believed him to be of sound mind. Her simple statement, devoid of emotion, was more powerful than any fiery retort. The emotional turmoil in the room was palpable. Sarah was caught between them, her loyalty to her brother warring with the undeniable evidence of his betrayal and the painful truth of his words. She began to cry, soft, choked sobs, her head bowed. I watched her, a pang of paternal grief piercing through my hardened resolve. This was the cost of truth, the price of justice. But it was a price I was willing to pay. For Margaret, for myself, for the very meaning of family, I needed to escalate. I needed to move beyond suspicion and bring forth undeniable proof, not just emotional accusations. I looked at Martha, then pointed with my chin to the stack of documents we had retrieved from the hidden safe. My original will, the house deed, and my old workshop ledgers. Martha, understanding my silent command, retrieved them and placed them on the table directly in front of David. David looked at the papers, his face draining of color. He asked what those were, his voice barely a whisper. I could almost see the cold dread seeping into his confident demeanor. Sarah, through her tears, looked up, her eyes curious. Martha, in her calm professional voice, explained that these were Mr. Vance's original legal documents, including his will and the deed to the house, as well as his meticulously kept business records. She said, "Mr. Vance wished for them to be reviewed." David snatched the will first, his eyes darting across the pages. He muttered something about it being old, outdated, and invalid. But his trembling hands, the sudden sweat beading on his forehead, told a different story. He then moved to the deed, his jaw clenching as he saw my name clear and unequivocal as the sole owner. Finally, he looked at the ledgers, their precise entries, a testament to the thriving business he had so carelessly dismissed and so hastily sold. The numbers didn't lie. They exposed his claims of financial hardship as a calculated fiction. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. David was utterly, completely speechless. His arrogance, his practiced composure had evaporated, replaced by a dazed disbelief, then a growing panic. He looked like a man who had walked into a mirror and seen a monster he didn't recognize. He muttered something about it being impossible, that he had everything in order, that he had the power of attorney. It was then I made my move. I struggled to reach for the whiteboard, my right hand still protesting, but my determination was absolute. Slowly, painstakingly, I scrawled one word: caution. Then I pointed to my bandaged wrist, then to the power of attorney document he had forced me to sign in the hospital, and then I shook my head emphatically. I then made a sweeping gesture around the house and pointed to David, then to my empty bank account, then back to the will's stipulations for my care. I conveyed with all the emotional force I could muster that his power of attorney was obtained under duress, that he had exploited my vulnerability, and that he had violated every sacred trust. David's face went white. He tried to speak, but only a strangled sound emerged. He looked utterly shattered, exposed. The perfect, ambitious son was now a shell of a man stripped bare of his carefully constructed lies. He was like one of my flawed wood pieces, suddenly revealing a deep, irreparable crack. Sarah, witnessing her brother's utter collapse, stared at him, then at me, then at the documents, her face a mixture of shock, disgust, and profound sorrow. She whispered, her voice barely audible, that she didn't know about any of this, that she had trusted David. The confrontation culminated in a legal process, initiated not by my voice, but by the quiet, undeniable power of those papers and Martha's courageous testimony. I had, with Martha's guidance and the help of a lawyer she found for me, discreetly presented my case to a pro bono legal aid organization. The lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Eleanor, quickly grasped the severity of the situation. She told me that while my physical limitations were a challenge, the documented evidence of fraud and undue influence, especially concerning the power of attorney and the clear discrepancies in the bank accounts, was compelling. She acknowledged the immense emotional pain this would cause, but assured me that justice was possible. The day of the hearing was a blur of heightened senses. The sterile scent of the courthouse, the hushed whispers of the people, the imposing figure of the judge. It all pressed in on me. I sat in my wheelchair, my new lawyer Eleanor by my side, a steady hand on my shoulder. Martha sat behind me, a pillar of quiet support. Across the aisle, David sat with his own lawyer, a slick, self-assured man. Sarah sat beside David, her face pale, her eyes downcast. She looked utterly defeated, a shadow of the vibrant young woman she once was. When Eleanor presented my case, her voice was calm, methodical, laying out the evidence with devastating clarity. She spoke of my lifelong dedication as a craftsman, the meticulous records in my ledgers, the clear provisions of my will regarding the house and my care. Then came the damning evidence. The bank statements showing David's illicit withdrawals, the timeline of the coerced power of attorney, and Martha's powerful testimony, describing my helplessness, my forced signature, and David's dismissal of my health concerns. Martha spoke of how she had witnessed David's aggressive attempts to control my finances and my desperate nonverbal attempts to communicate the truth. Her words, though calm, resonated with a raw, undeniable sincerity. The judge, a stern but fair woman, listened intently, her gaze often sweeping towards David, then to me. David's lawyer, a master of deflection, tried to paint me as confused as suffering from post-stroke delusions, and Martha as a disgruntled employee with an agenda. He attempted to dismiss my will as outdated and my ledgers as irrelevant. He even tried to suggest that David's actions were merely a well-intentioned but perhaps clumsy attempt to manage my affairs in my impaired state, all for my own good. But Eleanor countered every argument with cold, hard facts. She presented the broken photograph of Margaret, a physical symbol of the emotional damage, and described how Brenda had tried to conceal my fall. She presented the evidence of David's casual remark about selling the house overheard by Sarah. She spoke of the missing wooden carvings artifacts of my life, systematically removed. Each piece of evidence, each carefully constructed truth, was a hammer blow to David's edifice of lies. Then came the emotional climax, the moment of reckoning. Eleanor asked David to take the stand. He walked to the witness box, his usual swagger replaced by a nervous stiffness. Eleanor questioned him about the bank statements, the missing funds. He stammered, contradicted himself, trying to twist the narrative to justify his actions as necessary for my care. Eleanor then held up a copy of my will, the one that outlined my clear wishes for the house and my continued residency. She asked him directly if he had disregarded my explicit instructions, if he had intended to sell the house against my will. He tried to deny it, to obfuscate, but his voice was weak, his eyes betraying his guilt. Finally, Eleanor turned to me. She asked me for the court record to simply nod or shake my head, to convey whether I believed my son had acted in my best interest, whether I had truly given him consent to take control of my life and my assets. I looked at David, who was now staring at me, his face, a mixture of fear, anger, and a flicker of something that looked like desperate appeal. I looked at Sarah, whose eyes were filled with tears, begging me silently to forgive. But the love I had once felt, the yearning for their affection, had been replaced by a quiet, unyielding demand for truth. The bitter taste of betrayal, the pain of knowing my own son had systematically tried to erase me, was too profound to ignore. My heart ached, a deep, resonant sorrow for the family we had lost, for the dreams that had been shattered. But I could not betray myself again. Slowly, deliberately, I shook my head. A firm, unequivocal no. The courtroom fell silent, a heavy, deafening silence. David's face crumpled. His slick lawyer looked utterly defeated. Sarah let out a soft, choked sob, burying her face in her hands. In that moment, the truth, stripped bare of all pretense, stood revealed. It was a victory, but a hollow one, tinged with the profound sadness of a father watching his own son's downfall. The love and the demand for justice had finally found their painful, intertwined resolution. I had asserted my truth, my dignity, but at a cost that transcended any financial gain. My family, as I had once known it, was broken beyond repair. And the true meaning of that brokenness echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom, a testament to the bitter end of a legacy. The judge's gavel struck a sharp, resonant sound that echoed through the stunned courtroom, a final, unyielding pronouncement. Petition denied. Mr. Whitmore retains full control of his estate. Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioners acted in bad faith. Her words, delivered with calm authority, were a cold balm to my raw, aching spirit. The formal proceedings ended, but the true reverberations, the deeper aftermath, had only just begun. David sat utterly defeated, his face a ghostly white. His lawyer, a man whose confidence had evaporated like mist, gathered his papers in a hurried, almost frantic manner. Sarah beside David was openly weeping, her body racked with silent sobs. She looked up once, her eyes meeting mine, brimming with a mixture of shame, sorrow, and a desperate plea for understanding. I offered no comfort, no sign of forgiveness. My heart, though still aching with the ghost of paternal love, was too scarred, too hardened by the relentless betrayal. The time for that had passed. As people shuffled out of the courtroom, an uneasy silence settled, broken only by the whispers and rustling of papers. Eleanor, my lawyer, smiled kindly at me, telling me that justice had been served, that I had been brave. Martha squeezed my shoulder, her silent support a comfort beyond words. But for me, the victory felt hollow, tinged with a profound, almost unbearable sadness. There was no joy, no sense of triumph, only the heavy, undeniable weight of what had been lost. We returned to the house, but it felt different now. The tension that had permeated its walls for months, the silent battle of wills, had evaporated, replaced by a thick, oppressive quiet. David and Sarah were not there. They had left the courthouse in a hurry, avoiding my gaze, escaping into the anonymity of the bustling street. I knew then that the family I had strived to build, the legacy I had poured my life into, was irrevocably fractured. The dream of a harmonious, loving family living in the home I had crafted was dead. The days that followed were steeped in a profound, unsettling peace. My home, once a battlefield, was now merely a shell filled with ghosts of what once was. Martha remained a steady, comforting presence, her gentle care a stark contrast to the emptiness that surrounded me. She would sit with me, reading aloud from my favorite books, or simply tending to the garden, its vibrant colors. a mocking counterpoint to the grayness of my emotional landscape. I found myself spending hours in my workshop, the scent of cedar and sawdust, no longer a source of solace, but a bitter reminder of a life interrupted. My tools lay dormant, polished but unused. The half-finished music box for Margaret still sat on the workbench, a poignant monument to an unfinished dream. I would trace the lines of its intricate inlay, my fingers, though stronger now, still trembling slightly. The melody I had envisioned for it remained unheard, a silent symphony of loss. My heart ached, not with anger anymore, but with a deep, pervasive sorrow. I thought of David, the ambitious young man I had once admired, the boy whose eyes used to sparkle with curiosity when I taught him to carve. I thought of Sarah, my gentle daughter, whose laughter once filled these rooms. Where had it all gone wrong? Was it Margaret's death that had truly unraveled us? Or had the seeds of greed and ambition been sown, long before lying dormant, waiting for the opportune moment to bloom into this bitter harvest? I remembered the look on David's face in the courtroom, the utter devastation, the realization of his exposed deceit. I had expected a thrill of vindication, a sense of justice served. Instead, I felt only a profound pity, a father's ache for a son who had lost his way so completely. He had chosen money over family, ambition over love, and in doing so, he had lost far more than a lawsuit. He had lost his father, he had lost his soul. Sarah's tears, her look of desperate apology haunted me more. She had been caught in the crossfire, manipulated by her brother, blinded by her own busy life. But her complicity, however, passive, had allowed David's betrayal to flourish. She had remained silent when my dignity was stripped, when my voice was taken, when my home was threatened. And that silence, I realized, was a form of betrayal in itself. She was a good person, I believed, but goodness, unexpressed goodness, overshadowed by fear or convenience, could be as damaging as outright malice. There was no happy ending here. The family reunions, the shared laughter around the oak table, the comfortable silences, they were all gone, replaced by the stark reality of separation and loss. I had won my legal battle, I had reclaimed my property and my dignity, but at what cost? The price was the irreparable rupture of my family, the painful realization that love, once unconditional, could be twisted and corrupted by greed. One quiet afternoon, Martha found me in the living room staring at the empty fireplace. She asked me gently if I regretted it, the lawsuit exposing David, breaking the family. I thought about her question, letting the words hang in the still air. Regret. It was a complex emotion, not a simple yes or no. I told her I didn't regret seeking justice, that I couldn't allow myself to be erased, to let their greed define the end of my life. I said that allowing evil to flourish through silence was a greater betrayal. But I also told her that I regretted that it had ever come to this, that my children had chosen this path, that our family had crumbled into such a desolate ruin. I regretted the loss of what could have been the dreams of reconciliation that now lay shattered. I regretted that the love I had poured into them had yielded such a bitter harvest. Sometimes I wrote on my whiteboard, my hand steady now, the truth brings not happiness but peace. And that was the core of it. Peace. Not the effervescent joy of victory, but the quiet, deep-seated peace that comes with facing the ugly truth, with accepting what cannot be changed, and with standing firm in one's own convictions. I had lived a life of integrity, of honest labor, of unwavering love. I would not allow their betrayal to define my final chapter. My life, though dramatically altered, had found a new rhythm. Martha became more than a caregiver. She became a friend, a confidant, a quiet companion in my journey of acceptance. We would spend hours in the garden, a place of vibrant life and gentle growth. I, with Martha's assistance, began to tend to the plants, feeling the soil, watching the seedlings sprout. It was a slow, meditative process, a reminder that even after great loss, life continued finding new ways to flourish. I started carving again, not for others, not for a workshop, but for myself. Small, simple pieces at first, birds, leaves, abstract shapes. Each chip of wood, each smooth stroke of the chisel was a reaffirmation of my existence, a quiet act of defiance against the erasure they had attempted. The workshop, once a place of production, became a sanctuary for healing, a space where I could reconnect with the core of who I was. The music box for Margaret remained unfinished, a poignant symbol. But now it no longer represented despair. It represented resilience. It was a reminder that some stories, some loves, some legacies could not be contained or silenced. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I sat on my porch, swing Martha beside me. She asked me what my plans were for the future now that everything had settled. I looked out at the twilight, the familiar outlines of the trees against the fading light. My home, my refuge, was safe. My dignity was restored. My spirit, though scarred, was unbroken. I told Martha that I would live, not in bitterness, not in anger, but with purpose. I would live for the beauty of the everyday, for the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. I would find joy in small things, the warmth of the sun, the scent of the roses, Martha's kind presence. I would continue to carve, to create, to assert my existence in the face of what they had tried to do. And in doing so, I would ensure that my story, the true story, would endure. The betrayal had left deep wounds, unhealing scars on my heart. But through the crucible of that pain, I had discovered an inner strength, a profound understanding of what truly mattered. Family, I realized, was not just about blood or shared history, or even the house you inherited. Family was about connection, about respect, about enduring love, even when it was unspoken. And when those bonds were broken, sometimes the truest act of love was to acknowledge the fracture, to seek justice, and to find acceptance in the quiet solitude of your own truth. The house settled around us, its old timbers groaning softly, not with sorrow, but with a deep, resonant sigh of relief. It was no longer a tomb, but a testament to a man who had faced the ultimate betrayal and had, through his unwavering spirit, carved his own path towards peace. There was no grand reunion, no tearful reconciliation, just the quiet, dignified acceptance of what was, and the profound, humbling knowledge that even in profound loss, life and the human spirit found a way to endure, to heal, and to live again. The legacy I would leave behind would not be measured in wealth or property, but in the unyielding strength of my spirit, a story etched not in wood, but in the enduring memory of those who truly saw and understood.